All right. First question for today is this. Why is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sitting in a jail cell?
Because he held a march against the rules of this city, and they decided to lock him up.
He held a march which was against the rules, and the city punished him for it. In other words, he broke the law. King is in jail because he broke the law. Does King think that people should go around breaking laws? Is he an anarchist?
No.
Does he think everybody should decide for themselves which laws they will obey?
No.
So he must have had a particularly strong reason then for breaking the law, don't you think? He provides his reasoning for us in his famous letter. How many of you have read the letter from the Birmingham Jail before? Good, most of you. So you've encountered this before. We're going to focus in particular not on his historical claims, but on his jurisprudential claims in this class. We want to focus in particular on his legal reasoning. That is, the legal reasons he offers for defying the judicial order not to march, which an order which was backed by a properly promulgated law. He begins with a hypothetical question, sort of Socratic fashion. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? It's a good question. The answer, he says, is found in the fact that there are two types of law. There are just laws, and there are unjust laws. Where have we seen this idea that law and justice have something to do with each other? We saw it in Aristotle. Before that, we saw it in Aristotle's teacher's teacher, Socrates. Now remember, in both Socrates and Aristotle, we encounter the idea that justice is doing what the law commands, right? Socrates conceded that he had been convicted unjustly, but he thought he would be acting unjustly himself were he to flee Athens and the judgment of the law. Now we have, and we can fast forward to St. Paul, who talked about the law written on the heart, which God has implanted in rational beings, that is, human beings, so that they can understand what is right and wrong to do. And that same God had set up human authorities, he says in the 13th chapter of the letter to the Romans, to do you good, to help you do what is right. Now we have a new claim. And the claim is that justice and law might actually come into tension or even opposition with each other. So there are some laws, King claims, that are consistent with justice, and then others that are not. He says, I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Of course, here, St. Paul and Socrates and Aristotle and Antigone would all agree with him, wouldn't they? St. Paul says you have an obligation as a matter of conscience, religious conscience, to obey earthly rulers in his epistle to the Romans. Aristotle says that the just man follows the law in part because it is law which gives him his justice, which helps make him more virtuous in the virtue of justice. Conversely, however, Dr. King goes on, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Unjust law is no law at all. That seems like a contradiction. Is it a law or is it not a law? He seems to be violating principles of logic here, doesn't he? He continues, now what is the difference between the two? How does one determine when a law is just or unjust? Here's the standard. A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, whoever he is, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. Okay, that's his explanation. That's his legal argument for why he has a moral obligation to obey all these other laws over here, but to disobey this one. And he's citing as authority for this argument two cats who came after St. Paul. And their names are Augustine and Aquinas. So something important has happened in the thinking of Augustine and Aquinas, which in many ways looks very much the same or similar to the thinking of Socrates and Aristotle and St. Paul, but in at least one important respect looks quite radically different from those ancient thinkers, doesn't it? And so we need to dig pretty deeply into this thinking. It's no accident that this plaque, which I showed you earlier, which hangs on the wall in the Great Hall at the State Supreme Court building downtown, a few miles from here, is a full quote from the letter from Birmingham Jail, which expressly cites Aquinas. This is an important foundational part of the legal tradition that you are about to enter into as professional lawyers. So we're going to spend some time in Aquinas, both today and Wednesday, actually. We'll be working our way through key passages in the Treatise on Law. We begin at the beginning. In question 90, this is part one of the second part of Aquinas' Summa Theologica. If you want to see the entire Summa, it is in the Jurisprudence Special Collection in our library. It is Summa, all, everything. This is just one tiny little part of one slightly bigger part of an enormous treatise. The first thing to observe is that law, he says, is a reason for action. A reason for action. So right off the bat, in question 90, article 1, Aquinas is going to ratify Aristotle's idea that law is a guide to practical reason as human beings act in the world. So Aquinas is with Aristotle on what law essentially is. Law essentially is a reason to direct the actions of rational beings who are free to choose. Human beings, that is. He's not a determinist, like some of the folks we're going to meet later this semester, who think that your actions are determined by your selfish genes or by material forces beyond your control. No, you choose. You choose when you act, and you can choose to act for reasons. And law is one of those reasons, on the basis of which you choose and act, can choose and act, if you so choose. What kind of reason is it? Well, he says it's the kind of reason by which human acts are measured. He says that law in the human sense, is a rule and measure of acts. For human beings, beings that exercise practical reason as God does and are made in God's image, law provides a rule of human action not inevitably, as dogs eat meat or trees produce oxygen, but by appealing to man's reason. inducing him to act or restraining him from action. So humans participate in God's law voluntarily, and they participate in that part of God's law known as natural law through reason. Reason enables us to measure our acts, to critically evaluate and assess them, to discern whether our acts measure up to the law, whether our means and ends fit what the common good requires. And this is his argument for, well, here it is, law is a reason for action. So law you can think of as something like a measuring stick. Do you want to know whether your act is the correct action? You measure it against the law. Insofar as the law acts as a measuring stick by which you measure and critically evaluate your acts, law is your reason for acting. That's the basic image. And here's his argument. Very short syllogism that he gives you. It belongs to the law to command and to forbid. That's the function of law. This is an Aristotelian kind of argument. How do you know a dog? Well, dogs bark. Is this creature barking? Yep, then it's a dog. How do you know a human being? Well, human beings create things. Is this being creating things? Yep, well then it's a human being. How do you know if you have a law? Well, it belongs to law to command and to forbid. It also belongs to reason to command. And so law is something pertaining to reason. There's an inherent connection between law and reason, Aquinas says. And now we can stop and ask, what does he mean by reason? And here we need to go back to the beginning of the semester and notice that reason, we noticed in the very first class, is an ambiguous word, isn't it? Because there are two kinds of reasoning. Bless you. There's what we learned as theoretical reason. That's reasoning about what is the case. The sun rises in the east. I observe that the sun rises in the east. There has to be a reason for that. Why does the sun rise in the east? Theoretical reason, descriptive reasoning. I come up with an explanation of the way things actually are, which makes sense of my observation that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And that's different from practical reasoning, which is, what should I do? Should I put on a shirt and a tie and a coat and pants, especially pants? Right? Should I get in my car and go teach this foundations class? That's reasoning about what is to be done. Notice, Aquinas is engaged in theoretical reasoning about practical reasoning, which we've said from the beginning, that's what we're doing here in this course and in your legal studies. We're trying to figure out what is the case about people's practical reasoning, about the way that they choose and act. Okay, so there's two levels going on here. Aquinas is giving us an account, a descriptive or theoretical account, of the practical reasoning of human beings. As human beings act in the world, they can act, it's possible for them to choose to act according to law, to take law as a reason for their actions. How does this reason work? He gives us the basic mechanics of reason in reply to objection 2 on page 152. And this should look very familiar to you from 2 classes ago when we talked about law as reason. He's going to basically break down for you the elements of what Aristotle was doing in the Ethics. What Aristotle was doing in the Ethics was giving you logical arguments. He was reasoning with you about what is to be done. Aquinas says we can break those arguments down into their constituent elements. We can examine the pieces from which arguments and reasoning are constructed. First, he says, definition. That is, you need to define terms. First, definition. You need to define terms. The way that you define your terms is really important because terms are the basic building blocks. They're like the smallest Legos out of which we're going to construct reasoned arguments. We'll then combine terms to form propositions, secondly. And then third, we'll combine propositions to form syllogisms. And then we can string together multiple syllogisms into more elaborate arguments. So what is all this about? Aquinas is simply referring to the elementary tools of reason called logic. He's not claiming, by the way, he's not claiming that logic is all there is to reason. Logic is just a tool. It's just a tool for reasoning. But it's an essential tool. So suppose we want to prove the following proposition, or we want to test the following proposition. We want to inquire whether the following proposition is true as a matter of practical reasoning. Suppose we want to establish whether this is true. Murder is unjust and should be avoided. And the skeptic says, well, says you, I disagree. I kind of like murdering. I get off committing murder. So who are you to tell me what I should do? Can you make an argument? Can you prove that no one should commit murder? That as a matter of practical reasoning, there are good reasons not to murder. Anyone want to try? Give our skeptic an argument.
Because God said it's wrong.
Okay, you can appeal to authority. And you could go straight to the highest authority, God, whoever that is. Our skeptic says, I don't believe in your God. I don't believe in your flying spaghetti monster. I'm too well educated for that. That's an old, obsolete superstition. We don't need it anymore. So whatever your God tells you to do, that's fine. That's between you and your superstitious beliefs. That's not for me.
As society, we've decided that it's not right to kill somebody.
Okay, we could appeal to convention. We could appeal to convention. We could say, as a people, we, whoever we are, however we're defined, have decided that you shouldn't kill. But our skeptic says, well, first of all, you got a problem. Because I wasn't consulted. So I'm not part of the we. I don't agree. And secondly, what if we are wrong? We have been wrong about lots of things in the past. There are lots of societies that have condoned all sorts of things that you yourself think should not have been done and have forbidden things that I bet you yourself would think should be done.
Would it be appropriate to go back further and say something like, we don't want murder because it's bad, so then we need to define what good would be?
What does that mean? We don't want murder because it's bad. And that requires us to inquire what is good.
So that you need to figure out what you want in your society. So if that's good, then you need to figure out what the opposite of that is. So what's evil?
We need to figure out what we want in our society. But that sounds like the argument we just heard. That we as a society have decided that murdering is bad. But what if we're wrong? Or what if I don't agree? Or what if I wasn't consulted?
But if you know what's good and what's bad, then that's a better blueprint than just, yeah, we all sat down and said, hey, this is bad.
Why is it a better rule or measure to consult good or bad than what we have decided?
Dr. King pointed it out when he said, like, an unjust law is like the majority enforcing something on the minority that they aren't, like, themselves held up to. So, like, I guess something like that. Like, you have to find the balance of what the majority wants, but that is also good for the minority, and that would be murder is bad.
We have to find something that's good for the majority, on balance, and the minority.
Yes.
Well, our skeptic says, I'm the minority. I'm a minority of one. And actually, there's more of me. There are a bunch of us running around here. You still haven't given us a reason.
We have to go through the process of defining what good is, what evil is, why we don't want evil.
He's not interested in your processes. He's not trying out for the Alabama football team. He doesn't trust the process. He wants a reason. Don't give up so easily. Don't give up so easily. Would King or Aquinas, now we've heard two different appeals to the authority to justify the proposition that one should not murder. We heard one that appeals to divine authority. And we've met appeals like that this semester, haven't we? They've historically played a significant role in the law. We heard an appeal to convention. We're going to meet a very strong appeal to convention or custom when we get to the common lawyers in a couple of weeks. So these are arguments for normative force or reason to do or not to do things which have played historically important roles in our law. But our skeptic doesn't believe in God, and he doesn't care about your conventions, and he doesn't care what the majority thinks. He doesn't even care what a plurality thinks. I'm a minority of one. Convince me. What do you mean by good and bad? What do you mean by good and bad?
We have to preserve human life.
Okay, is life good?
Yes.
Is life good whether or not our moral skeptic is ready to assent to the proposition that life is good?
Yes.
Ah, so you're claiming that good and bad are independent of divine command, convention, subjective belief. That these are objective standards of action. Is that your claim?
Yes.
Yes, and you're in good company, aren't you? Because that is what King and Aquinas are saying. That good and bad can be known through the exercise of human reason, and even if reason fails to apprehend them, they remain good or bad. So a person who is a moral skeptic who denies that human life is good is just wrong. We might even go so far as to say unjust. These are objective standards by which we can evaluate human actions that stand independent of human choice and action itself. That's the claim. Strong medicine, isn't it? So here's the argument if you wanted to break it down in terms that Aquinas might ratify. We'll start by defining our terms. What is good? Well, good is something to be preserved or pursued or done. That's what good is. All right? What is evil? Well, evil is something to be avoided or not done. What is human life? Well, human life is a form of good. Human life is good. And notice, so far we have three identity propositions. Two of them refer to the same term, good. And so logically we can substitute human life for good in our first definition, or we can substitute good for human life in our third definition. Either way, it looks an awful lot like what? Good is something to be done or preserved or pursued. What is murder? Murder is the deliberate destruction of innocent human life without justification. We've defined the term murder. Now, if we've correctly defined our terms, we can combine the terms into premises. Good is to be preserved and evil avoided. The proposition about the relation between good and evil, now that we've defined them, which follows from the combination of their definitions. Human life is to be preserved and its destruction avoided. How do we know that? Well, we've already seen that good is something to be preserved and human life is good. So if human life is good, we can just substitute human life for good in the first definition, and it follows that human life is something to be preserved, and its destruction is to be avoided. And since murder is the deliberate destruction of human life, it follows that murder is unjust and should be avoided. Does the argument hang together? Does it hang together even if our moral skeptic denies its truth? Yes. That's the strong medicine here. That there are certain things that are good and evil, good and bad, whether or not any particular person assents to the truth of that claim. Yes.
I'm just thinking about when we say human life is good, but then I think about the murderer. Is the life of a murderer good? So if we change that to be like an exception, is that how we come up with capital punishment being just?
Capital punishment is a one step further removed from the basic argument because it requires us to confront what? Where would we press on this argument if we wanted to get into capital punishment? And we will later this semester, by the way. We're going to get into all the controversial stuff.
That evil is something to
We're baby steps right now. We're getting there.
the evil's to be avoided.
Well, do people who support capital punishment deny that evil should be avoided? Or do they simply deny that capital punishment is evil? On what basis might they deny that capital punishment is evil?
Value of human life, making something of injustice.
Whoa, I can't listen to 5 people at once. Show me a hand and I'll call it. Yeah.
They're arguing about the second point about how human life is able to be preserved and that destruction should be avoided.
Are they? I've heard a lot of people argue in defense of capital punishment, and they all say capital punishment is justified precisely because human life is valuable. Right? Because we have to vindicate its intentional destruction. We have to sanction its intentional destruction to vindicate the life of the victim. That's the argument they give. Now, whether that's a correct argument is a different question. But they think you've not yet convinced them that capital punishment is unjust. In fact, you've just mischaracterized their argument, I think. But what's the actual disagreement about?
It's that good is to be preserved.
Do they disagree with that? Does someone who supports capital punishment disagree that good is to be done?
No, they're trying to say that, like, murderers should be punished in order to preserve the good. Murder should be avoided. I mean, sorry. Yes. Wait. Sorry, I confused my own self.
Does the capital punishment abolitionist and the capital punishment defender, do they agree that good is to be done? Do they agree that evil is to be avoided?
Yes.
Yes. Do they agree that human life is good? Yes. What do they disagree about? What's left to disagree about?
Who deserves it?
What's murder? How is murder properly defined? That's what the argument about capital punishment essentially is. How do we know that? Because we just walked through all the propositions that could be disagreed about. You see? This logic stuff is really neat, isn't it? Now we got to the heart of the disagreement. We have a disagreement about what murder is. So the person who defends capital punishment is going to say, I believe life is good. I believe we should not do evil. And I believe that murder, therefore, should not be done. And that's precisely why we should sanction the murderer with capital punishment. And what's the abolitionist going to reply? But capital punishment is itself a form of murder because it's not morally justified, and therefore what you're doing is you're responding to a wrong with another wrong. And wrong is to be done, not to be done. And then we're going to have an argument about which acts of killing are justified. Yeah? And now we've engaged the actual disagreement, haven't we? So we don't have to think of people who support capital punishment as evil. We don't have to think of them as morally deficient. And we don't have to think of the people who want abolition of capital punishment as somehow weak-minded, mamby-pamby, bad reasoners, right? We can engage the actual merits of the argument. And notice how much respect we accord to each other when we do that. Yeah? We're not mischaracterizing each other's arguments. We're not calling each other names. We're not drawing bad inferences and assuming the worst of each other. We're engaging on the merits of the proposition or the term which is actually contested. That's what this enables you to do. That's what this course is all about. All right? So by the time you get to the end of the semester, to issues like assisted suicide and abortion and the definition of marriage and some of those really, really contested questions, we'll be able to do it. We'll be able to go about it in a reasoned way. That's the goal. We'll get there. Okay? You get it? You get it? You see how it works? Okay. So here it is. Here's the entire argument in 2 syllogisms. Aquinas is going to teach you how to reason critically to the conclusion, the uniquely correct conclusion, he thinks, that murder is unjust and should be avoided. Okay? You see how he did it, yeah? Terms combine into propositions, propositions combine into syllogisms, syllogisms we string together to form arguments, and we can critically evaluate any step of that construction process. So Aquinas has just given you the basic tool set for doing what Aristotle told you you should be doing 2 classes ago. Yeah? Okay. Now let's return to Aquinas' general argument in question 90. Remember, this is his argument for the proposition, the conclusion, that law is a reason for action. He says, it belongs to the law to command and forbid. It belongs to reason to command. Therefore, law is something pertaining to reason. Okay. Where have we seen the major premise before? Have we met anyone this semester who would agree that it belongs to law to command and forbid? Socrates? Who else? Could Hammurabi sign on to that? Yep. Could Moses sign on to that? St. Paul? What about Creon? Yeah. Where might the disagreement between St. Paul and Creon come in? Would they disagree that it belongs to law to command and forbid?
They would disagree on what is the law.
They might disagree on the definition of the term law. But so far, just about everyone we've met this semester could assent to the proposition that it belongs to the law to command and forbid, couldn't they? Now, as we get further into the semester, we'll meet some people who disagree with that proposition. But so far, as late as the 1300s, everybody agrees that law has something to do with commanding and forbidding. And then the minor premise, it belongs to reason to command. Have we met anyone yet this semester who would agree with that proposition, or who would advocate for that proposition? Socrates? Aristotle? Remember Creon had a son? Haman? What did Haman say about the lawfulness of his father's edict? Did he think his father's edict was law in a perfect, complete sense? Why not? What did his father fail to do, according to Haman? Think reasonably, and specifically consult the reason of whom? The wise, the elders, those who insisted that even though Antigone had violated Creon's edict, that she had not acted unlawfully, because Creon himself had issued an unlawful or unwise or unreasonable edict. Okay? All right, so Aquinas is going to basically ratify all of that. He's going to ratify all of those claims that we've encountered already this semester, and he's going to give us a little more precision. So back to page 152, the paragraph that begins, I answered that. I answered that. Law is a rule and measure of acts whereby man is induced to act or is restrained from acting. For lex, law, is derived from legare, to bind, because it binds one to act. Now the rule and measure of human acts is the reason, which is the first principle of human acts, as is evident from what has been stated above, since it belongs to the reason to direct to the end, which is the first principle in all matters of action, according to the philosopher. Who's the philosopher? Aristotle. He has so much regard for Aristotle, he doesn't even use his name. He's just the philosopher. Now that which is the principle in any genus is the rule and measure of that genus. For instance, unity in the genus of numbers and the first movement in the genus of movements. Consequently, it follows that law is something pertaining to reason. That's his argument. So we have this big category of practical reasons. Yeah? Reasons are those which induce or motivate good human actions. A human being who's acting correctly, justly, rightly for the good is acting on the basis of reasons. And within that category of motivations, we have these reasons that are called laws. So laws are part of those motivations which direct human beings to good ends. But they're a particular kind of part. They're a rule and measure. Way back here. Rule and measure. What does he mean by that? Well, suppose you're building a swing set for your kids. You need to build a brace between the posts. Build an A-frame, put a brace in between them, you put two posts, you put a brace in between them. You want to do that to stabilize the swing set so it doesn't collapse into your kids and kill them, right? Right? How are you going to know where to cut the brace? Suppose you put your posts 10 feet apart, and you have a board that's 8 feet long. You're going to use that for your brace? Obviously not. Why not? Because you measured it and it came out too short. That's how you're supposed to use the law, Aquinas is suggesting. You're supposed to use the law to measure your actions and see whether they come up too short. How do they measure up to the objective standard that's going to produce a good result? A good swing set is going to have a brace that's long enough to brace the posts. And notice all of this is an objective standard. Law is the ruler by which we measure whether acts are just or unjust. It enables us critically to evaluate the means and ends which people adopt and employ when acting. So we can evaluate kings' actions as justified by reference to the ends that he intended to bring about, racial desegregation, and the means he employed to bring them about, peaceful protests and going to jail. We can also evaluate unjust actions by the same rule. Actions that are directed to good ends, such as peace and order in the city of Thebes, might nevertheless be pursued by bad means, such as Creon's edict. Alternatively, you could have justifiable means, such as building a fence alongside one's neighbor's house lot, for bad ends, only for the purpose of depriving him of sunlight when he shaves in his bathroom, right? So law then provides the rule or the measure by which we critically evaluate our actions. Did you ingest heroin before coming to class today? Why not? Well, I can't understand all of it. When, especially when you have masks on. You're having a massive holdup here. Why didn't you ingest heroin before you came to class today? Just give me a reason. Was it reasonable? You didn't have any on hand? That's good. It's really expensive. Money is hard to get. Yeah? Those are reasons. They're good reasons. There's a better reason.
I don't want to die.
You don't want to die. Right? Heroin is bad for you. Yeah? Yeah. That's how it works. It's not rocket science. Okay? Law is just the same kind of reason as heroin is bad for me, and therefore I won't take it. Okay? Any questions about that? Any questions about question 90? Have we accomplished something today? Good. We've got more to do. Getting warmed up. Step back. All right. Okay. So law is a special kind of reason. It's a reason by which we measure our actions to see whether they measure up to what is good and just. Yeah? So it has a special kind of authority. Laws are authoritative reasons. And to understand this, we need to unpack what Aquinas means by reasons and what he means by authority. And he locates the authority of law. Here it is. He locates, this is what we were just talking about with the swing set. I should have gone forward instead of backwards. Okay, he locates the authority of law in different places. The authority of law depends in part upon the reasons themselves, and in part, for reasons we'll see, on the source of the reasons. So the authority of a law, the efficacy of a particular legal reason for action to direct your choices and actions, depends in part upon the reasons themselves and in part on the sources of the reasons. And he says there are different sources of reasons, known as law. The overall source, Aquinas is a Christian, he says, is God, specifically the God of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. And God himself is ruled by a law, by his own choice. He chooses to rule and measure his own actions by a law. This law is known as the eternal law. The eternal law just is. It has no beginning and end. It's eternal, like God himself. This is the inherent order of God, the inherent good of God. From this law, God dispenses law to his human creatures by two different channels. And you've already met them. The law of revelation, called the divine law, which is what we studied last class, and we're just now going to bracket that and set it aside. We'll come back to it at the end of the semester. We're going to spend all our time today in next class on the other channel, which is the law of reason, or the natural law. And from these two channels, human beings derive human laws. The Uniform Commercial Code, the ordinances of the city of Montgomery, which require you to wear a mask when standing within 6 feet of persons on a public sidewalk or whenever you enter a public building. Those are human laws, and they are human laws insofar as they are derived from the higher sources of law, divine and natural law. We're going to focus on natural law, which Aquinas thinks is available for the exercise of reason. So it's available then, he's agreeing with St. Paul on this, even to people who don't believe in God, or who don't believe in the Hebrew God, or the Christian God. You can access it through reason, in ways that we're going to talk about. Using your reasoning, you can figure this stuff out, a lot of it. Okay. Why is it that human beings can access the natural law even if they don't believe in God? The reason is that human beings are rational beings. So again, he's agreeing with Aquinas. Human beings participate in the eternal law because they are rational beings. This is the sense in which they are created in the image of God. They reason about what is good and right to do. But participation in the eternal law, as we've just seen, is complicated. You can participate in the eternal law by promulgating a law for yourself. You made a promise to yourself that you are going to enroll in law school and then graduate and pass the bar. And now that's a law for your reasons and actions. How do I know that? Because you're all here. And you're all going to study for my final. And you're all going to ace it, right?
Yes.
Why? Because you have made a law for yourself. You promised yourself that you're going to do the hard, painful work of studying the law. Yeah? In a more complex way, when you encountered my syllabus for the first time, what did you find there? Law. Did you make that law for yourself? No. Who made that law? I did. Okay? So there are some laws which we promulgate for ourselves, other laws which other people promulgate for us. And so the sources of law are going to begin to look very complex, aren't they? And as we disaggregate those sources, we're going to find different things that you are already familiar with. We're going to find contract law, and property law, and statutory criminal law, uniform commercial codes. Okay. But all of that, Aquinas says, insofar as it is law, is not arbitrary. It is reason. It is reason. And it is law insofar as it is reason. Aquinas says that what makes a law is that it is a rule and measure for our reasoned actions. And so a law that's completely arbitrary. Only red-headed people are allowed to come to Foundations of Law on Monday. You're welcome. Tight squeeze. Maybe the beard counts. It's a matter of legal interpretation. Submit it to the dean. Arbitrary, right? In a sense, it's a law, because I said it, and I'm the professor. But does it look much like a law to you? Does it provide you a really persuasive reason and rule for your actions? Okay. So what makes a law is in part that it is reason, but also what makes a law, human laws, positive laws, are that they are promulgated by someone with the authority to promulgate them. And this is the dilemma. This is the source of the dilemma. Now, divine law bears on human law indirectly. As I said, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to blow quickly through question 91, just to touch on it, especially Article 4. Aquinas says that God gave us divine law to do the jobs that human law cannot do. God gave us divine laws in Holy Scripture for 4 reasons. Very briefly, they are that humans are made for eternal happiness, but our natural faculty of reason can only apprehend our temporal happiness, but we are not temporal beings. We are eternal beings. And so God gave us divine law to direct our actions toward our eternal good. That's the first reason. The second reason is that human judgment is uncertain. God gave us divine law, which is inerrant. Human judgment is uncertain, whereas divine law is inerrant. The third reason is that humans can make laws governing action, but they cannot make laws governing motivations. We cannot rule each other's vices and virtues. That's why we need divine law. Remember the 10 Commandments? Don't covet. It's not enough for you simply not to commit adultery with your neighbor's wife. You also shouldn't covet your neighbor's wife. Now, if you serve in the military, you might encounter a positive law which prohibits you from committing adultery. But does the military sanction you for lusting after your neighbor's wife? No. That's not the job of human law. That's the job of divine law, to be concerned about virtues and vices. Sort of. We'll get to some important qualifications to that next class. Fourth, human laws cannot punish or forbid all evil deeds. To try to forbid all evil deeds would entail forbidding many good deeds, so human law leaves the prohibition of some evil deeds to divine law alone. Okay, that's the divine law side. You had a question?
Yes, so, okay, so we're saying human law judges our actions, and divine law judges our motives, so are we saying natural law directs our motives?
Divine law is there to work on our motivations and our character. It also directs our actions insofar as human reason is sometimes insufficient or errant with respect to our actions. So divine law is there both to direct our actions, to make sure we don't mess up our reasoning, and to assess our motivations. Don't covet.
So then where does the natural law come in? I think
We're getting there. That's where we're headed. Yep. We're getting to natural law next. Okay, natural law. This is where we're going to spend most of our time. Aquinas says that the law must promote the good. Divine law is given, we've just learned, for our eternal good. Natural law is given to us for our common good. Our common good. Those goods that we all share in common. Okay, so think back to the argument against murder. Where do these premises come from? Where does this come from? This idea that good is to be preserved and evil avoided. Or that human life is good. How do we know that these claims are true? Are they true? And if so, how do we know? We know, Aquinas says, for the same reason that St. Paul said we know, and that is that we know through the gift of reason which God has given us that certain propositions about actions are true, that certain things are objectively good, and certain things are objectively evil. And these first principles by which we can reason to what is good and evil and right and wrong are known as the natural law. And he has a lot to say about it in question 94, beginning on page 172 in your text. The natural law is appointed by reason, he tells us in Article 1. So the natural law is appointed by reason, meaning we don't do it simply out of habit. We don't do it simply because we desire to do it. In fact, there are many times when we desire not to do what the natural law requires. God gave us reason specifically so that we can govern our passions and appetites and habits and direct them by reason toward what is good. I want to eat a fourth piece of chocolate cake before I go to bed. But my reason tells me that's going to be bad for me, and so I'm going to govern that desire and rule over it. I'm going to apply the rule or measure of my actions, that is the natural law, and evaluate that desire and say that's an unjust desire. I would be unjust to myself by doing that because that would tend toward my ill health. All right? Where do we get these reasons? Well, Aquinas says that there are some reasons which are just self-evident. He calls them indemonstrable principles. Question 94, Article 2, on page 173. There are certain precepts that are self-evident, like good is to be preserved and evil is avoided, and human life is good. They are indemonstrable and they are self-evident. What does this mean? This means that they cannot be proven, but they require no proving. You just know them to be true. How do you know them to be true? Well, try denying them. Try to deny that good is to be done and evil is avoided. All right? And he compares these first principles of practical reasoning with the first principles of speculative reasoning, logic. Like the principle of non-contradiction. The principle of non-contradiction cannot be proven. But it doesn't need to be proven because everybody knows it's true. If I say, I am a man, but I am not a man, what am I saying? Am I saying anything coherent? No, why? Because it's a contradiction. If I say something that is contradictory, I have not said anything at all. The same thing cannot both be affirmed and denied at the same time. Do I have to prove to you that the same thing cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time? No. But do I need to prove it, according to Aquinas? No, because you know it to be true. You know it to be the case that if I say the same thing cannot be, you know it to be the case that the same thing cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time. Because if I say I am a man and I am not a man, what you hear is me speaking incoherence, babbling, nonsense. Aquinas says the first principles of practical reason work the same way. Can he prove to you that good is to be done and evil is to be avoided? No. Does he need to? No, because he thinks you know it. You know it simply by virtue of being a reasonable being. Try denying it. Does this mean that everyone is always going to agree on difficult moral questions? Well, no, because these are just the first principles. We have a lot of work to do in our reasoning before we get down to correct conclusions. And there's lots of opportunities to go wrong between the first self-evident principles and correct conclusions. The longer the argument gets, the more reasoning is required, the more opportunities there are for error. And we're fallible and we make mistakes. So people are going to disagree about what the natural law requires. But that's not because the first principles aren't self-evident, Aquinas says. They are self-evident. It's because we go wrong in our reasoning. We make mistakes. Okay. Now, that's the first thing. The natural law begins with these first principles. But the first principles have to be given specification. Even if we all agree that murder is to be avoided, we still have to figure out what to do with it. If someone commits a murder, what are we going to do about it? What will our positive laws, what will our human laws say about murder? We need specific sanctions for murder. The sanctions should be proportionate to the act. So if someone commits an intentional killing, that is murder in the first degree, presumably that sanction is going to be punished more vigorously than, say, a negligent homicide, for reasons that we'll get into shortly. All of that means that we have to have murder laws that are promulgated. Someone has to decide exactly how our human law is going to respond even to unjust acts like murder. So, if there were a rule in class, for example, hypothetically, that you were supposed to wear a mask before coming in, can you justify that rule on the basis of natural law? Is it reasonable to have a rule during a global pandemic with a novel virus requiring people to wear masks? What would be the natural law argument for it?
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Okay, we're starting with a self-evident principle. The second great commandment. Let's stipulate for the moment, just for the sake of simplicity, that's self-evident. Some people might disagree, but how do you get from there to the specification that you should wear a mask?
Health is to be preserved and illness avoided.
Okay? Just your health or everyone's health?
Everyone.
If health is a reason, and it's a reason that's peculiar to the kind of being that you are, and you look around and you see other beings who are the same kind of beings, is health also a reason for them? And is their health a reason for your action, just like your health is a reason for their action? And if we're trying to preserve health because it's a reason for everyone's action, that it is an aspect of our common good, is it reasonable to require people to wear masks to preserve other people's health? Yeah, it's not unreasonable, right? You can come up with a natural law argument. But someone still has to decide you're going to wear a mask within 6 feet, but not within 8 feet. Is that arbitrary? In a sense, it's arbitrary. It requires a choice, doesn't it? But is it arbitrary to require people to wear a mask within 6 feet during a global pandemic? No. It's reasonable. It's grounded in natural law principles, self-evident principles of practical reason. Okay? So we need someone to stipulate the precise requirements of law, the particular provisions of the ruler, even in cases where the general law is justified on grounds of reason available to all. So when Aquinas says that laws are enacted for the common good, the common benefit, he's saying the laws are enacted on the basis of reasons that we all share. But someone has to decide. Someone must actually specify the particular command of law which is to govern our choices and actions. You see? But commands are not the only kind of law, Aquinas says. So flip back with me now to question 92, Article 2 on page 163. He's going to give us a slightly more complicated picture of law. Law is not just commands and prohibitions. He says there are essentially three kinds of law. Human law now. Commands. Some laws command, other laws permit, and others punish, sanction, or remedy. These three kinds of law are suited to the three kinds of human action. Acts of virtue, which are good generically, which a good law will command. Acts of vice, which are evil generally, in which a good law will forbid. And acts that are generally indifferent, which a good law will permit. And Aquinas notes that even punishment meted out by law can lead us to becoming good. For at first we avoid doing evil for fear of punishment, but then he says, from being accustomed to avoid evil and fulfill what is good through fear of punishment, one is sometimes led on to do so likewise with delight and of one's own accord. I require my children to eat vegetables at first out of fear of punishment. They won't get dessert if they don't eat the vegetables. But over time, they come to enjoy eating the vegetables, and they feel healthier when they eat the vegetables, And then when they grow up and leave home and are cooking for themselves, hopefully they'll eat vegetables. All right? So law can lead us to do what is good of our own accord. All right, from all of this, go all the way back to question 90 now. From all of this can be unpacked from Aquinas' definition of law, page 155. Law is this. It has 4 aspects, which we covered very, very quickly today. Law has 4 aspects, which we've covered very quickly today. It is an ordinance of reason for the common good made by him who has care of the community and promulgated. Let's review what this means. Law is an ordinance of reason. Law is reason. It's a special kind of reason, meaning it's not irrational. It's not arbitrary. It's not purely subjective. It's not nonsense. And law is an ordinance. It specifies for particular cases what action best promotes the general principles of reason. So the law contained in my syllabus, for example, which gives me the power to question you in class about the readings, and requires you to do the readings before coming to class, and specifies how your grade is going to be assessed, i.e. on the final exam. All that law is an ordinance of reason. It's an ordinance. I have ordained it. I've given it specific form. I've given you specific rules and reserved for myself specific powers, which you need to know if you want to succeed in this course. But it's all for reasons, and specifically the reason of our common good. The common good in this class is knowledge of the foundations of law. That's our common good. I've given you the specific rules. I've ordained, giving you the ordinances, ordained those rules for a reason. You can critically evaluate the justification of that reason for yourself, can't you? Is knowledge of the foundations of law a good thing? It is if you want to be a lawyer. Okay. So it's an ordinance of reason. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it's for the common good. Aquinas believes and teaches that there are certain goods which we all share. And law promotes those goods that we share as beings who share the same nature, rational agents created in the image of God. So law then is not about what will come to be known as individual interests. We're going to meet some thinkers later this semester who are not going to talk about a common good, they're going to talk about what are known as interests. And then later we'll meet some folks who are going to talk about what are known as preferences. Interests and preferences are held by individual persons. The common good is shared by all human persons. Aquinas is talking about goods that we all share, like life and health and knowledge. And we share them, even those who don't agree that those are good still share them. They're objectively good, whether or not you assess them or not. It's not about collective political decisions, and it's not about individual interests. According to Aquinas, there is a common good, which we all share and which we all know. What's good for you is good for me and good for the community of which we're both part. Third, made by him who has care of the community, which is to say that there is such a thing as authority. I have the authority, right? There is an authority. There is a lawgiver. And lawgivers have authority because it's good. Someone has to have the authority to specify the ordinance of reason. But this also implies a natural limitation on authority, doesn't it? Law isn't whatever ordinance comes out of the lawmaker's mouth. Creon was simply wrong about that. Because it has to be ordained to the common good, remember? But there is authority. This is where the tension is going to come in, which we're going to go back to in just a moment. So there is authority. St. Paul was right. We need authority. Authority is good. And promulgated. Law is a human creation. The The fourth element is that law is promulgated. It's created, human law is created by humans, the way that divine and natural law are created by God. The natural law is the same for all and known to all, but it only consists of the general principles. Someone has to give it the specific ordinances, the specific form. And that's the job of the lawmaker. And the lawmaker has to carry out that authority by promulgating, by telling you the rules in propositions that you can understand, that appeal to your reason. Okay? So those are the four elements of law. Notice what this means. If law is law by virtue of consisting of all four elements, that means it can go wrong in four different ways. So what does it mean that an unjust law is an unjust law? It could mean one of four different things. We need to know more about that law before we can critically evaluate its justification. It could be that the law is irrational, arbitrary, that is, it fails to be reasoned, or that it's too general, it's not an ordinance. So it could fail in the first sense of not appealing to our reason. It's irrational or arbitrary, too ambiguous or abstract. It could be that it fails to promote the common good. It promotes the good, the private interests of the elite at the expense of the many, for example. Corrupt laws fail in that second respect. Right? Or three, it could be that it doesn't come from the right source. Someone purported to make the law, but they didn't actually have the authority to do so. We're going to meet arguments about this kind of failure when we get to the Constitution of the United States later. And we're going to read from those who advocated for ratification of the Constitution that there are certain powers of law that belong to one branch which should not be exercised by a different branch of government. And if this branch exercises the legal powers of this branch, then it's acting unlawfully, beyond its authority. And then fourth, it could be that there's a failure of promulgation. The law wasn't promulgated or it wasn't promulgated well. Okay, so if a law fails to satisfy the definition of law, there's a sense in which it is not a law. But there may be three different senses in which it is a law. And now you begin to see the complication that King is struggling with as he's sitting in the Birmingham Jail. Right? We can ask, is a command a law if it is unreasonable? Or if it is not good? Or if it usurps proper authority? Or if it's not sufficiently promulgated? A law might be reasonable, that is rational, good, in the sense that it's pointing to some good end, comes from the correct authority, the Birmingham City Council, but it's not sufficiently promulgated. It fails to be a law in the fourth sense, even though it's a valid law in the first three senses. And you can do the same with any of the other three elements. Okay? So, now we can go back to King's letter and read it a little more closely. Now that we've examined closely the sources that King is consulting, specifically Aquinas' treatise on law, let's put you in different shoes for a moment. Suppose you're not King. Suppose you're a state police officer in Selma, Alabama on March 7, 1965, standing in front of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, across the Alabama River in Selma. And the chief of the police station sees you at the Edmund Pettus Bridge and says, don't let them across. What should you do? Do you have a law as a rule and measure of your actions? Let's start at the bottom. Was it promulgated? Yep. Don't let them across. Is it from a correct authority? Yep. What about these two? Do you have reason to believe that this order fails on one or both of those counts. They disagreed about that, didn't they? But there were some people who thought that they had reason to believe that the orders failed, i.e., John Lewis and the others who walked across the bridge. King is claiming he's in the same boat. What does he say here? Is this order law? He says it's law in one sense, but not in another sense. And he wants us to pay attention specifically to what Aquinas says about unjust or tyrannical laws, which we encounter on page 161 in your text. Question 92, Article 1, Reply 4. What does it mean that a law is an unjust law? Another word for unjust is tyrannical in the natural law tradition. Aquinas says a tyrannical law, though not being according to reason, is not a law. A tyrannical law, through not being according to reason, is not a law, absolutely speaking, but rather a perversion of the law. All right, so the maxim, an unjust law is no law, looks like a contradiction when we first encountered it, didn't it? Looks like King was babbling, speaking nonsense. No, he's saying pay close attention. There's a sense in which it's a law, and a sense in which it's not a law. So a tyrannical law is a perversion of law. And yet, insofar as it is something in the nature of law, it aims at the citizens being good. For it still has, in the nature of a law, consistent with being an ordinance made by a superior to his subjects, and aims at being obeyed by them, which is to make them good. Not simply, but with respect to that particular government. It is promulgated. It rests on authority. It is promoted to some good. So what then is the reasonable response, the correct response of a reasoned agent, a human being created in the image of God, to a law like this? A law which is in one sense law, but is in another sense a perversion of law. King tells us in his letter. He says the response is, in short, to disobey the law and accept the punishment for the disobedience. Why? Because the failure of the law is a failure with respect to the common good and to reason. The law fails to provide you a sufficient reason for action. In fact, insofar as it is directly contrary to the natural law, you have a conclusive reason for action not to obey it. But it is still law if it is authoritative and promulgated. And insofar as he who is ordained by God to wield the sword for your good has promulgated it, even if it's unreasonable and unjust in that sense, you have an obligation to accept the punishment. Why would you do that? You would do it to prick the conscience of your fellow human beings who themselves are by nature reasonable, but have grown perverted in their reasoning by virtue of following unjust laws. So we'll just close with this. In no sense, King says, do I advocate evading or defying the laws the rabid segregationists would do. So he's flipping it on his head. He's been accused of being lawless because he refuses to obey this order. And now he's going to flip the whole thing on its head, and he's going to give an argument why it's the segregationists who are the ones that are lawless, not he. That would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do it openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice.
For more understanding of law, rights, and each other, see my new book, The Age of Selfies, Reasoning About Rights When the Stakes Are Personal. and visit my website, www.adamjmcleod.com.